There is a peculiar truth about streets lined with mature oak trees and lawns trimmed with obsessive precision. They whisper of stability, of a hard-won peace. But look closer, peer over the perfectly painted white picket fences, and you will learn that they are not always designed to keep the world out. Sometimes, they are built to hide the demons within. On one such street, a quiet cul-de-sac, where the only notable sounds were the cheerful arguments of blue jays and the distant hum of lawnmowers, lived David, a retired librarian whose life had been meticulously, quietly curated. Since his wife, Eleanor, had passed, his world had shrunk to the peaceful confines of his home and the vibrant, breathing tapestry of his garden. It was his sanctuary, a living memorial of color and fragrance. But peace in a place like this is a fragile ecosystem, easily poisoned by a single invasive species. That species arrived in the form of Mark, the man who bought the house next door. Mark was everything David was not: loud, aggressively successful, with a charismatic smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He was the kind of man who saw a quiet life not as a choice, but as a failure. The war began subtly, but it ended here, in the cold, gray light of dawn. David stood on his back porch, a ceramic mug of tea growing cold in his hand, and surveyed the carnage. His backyard was no longer a garden, it was a wound. The prize-winning roses, the ones Eleanor had planted their first year in this house, were hacked to shredded stumps. The small stone cherub she had adored now lay in pieces, its smiling face pulverized. And across the pristine white siding of his house, splashed in a violent arc, was red paint gleaming wetly in the morning sun like fresh blood. This was not random vandalism. It was a surgical execution of joy. David didn't need to guess who did it. For the past 24 hours, a small, blinking red light on his security camera had been his silent, patient witness. Inside, on his tablet, he had already watched the footage. He saw Mark, his perfect neighbor, move with a methodical, chilling hatred under the cloak of darkness, destroying not just plants and property, but the last vestiges of David's peace. David watched the recording 3 times, his initial shock and grief slowly calcifying into something cold, something hard, something heavy in his chest. This was not about a trashed yard. It was a declaration. And as David stood there, the stillness around him was not the calm of defeat, but the profound, terrifying silence of a storm gathering its strength just beyond the horizon. Mark had made a terrible mistake. He assumed the quiet man next door was a weak man. Before the storm, there was a profound and beautiful quiet. David's life was a collection of meticulously curated rituals, each one a small, silent testament to a love that had outlasted a lifetime. His mornings did not begin with the jarring scream of an alarm clock, but with the gentle persuasion of the sun as it filtered through the leaves of the ancient maple tree outside his bedroom window. He would rise, put the kettle on for tea, and step out onto the back porch, breathing in the cool, damp air of the new day. This was his kingdom. Not a kingdom of power or wealth, but of memory and peace. The garden was his great work, a living, breathing collaboration that he continued to build with his late wife, Eleanor. Every plant had a story. The climbing clematis, with its star-shaped purple flowers, was from their 25th anniversary trip to the English countryside. The row of proud, towering sunflowers were grown from seeds Eleanor had saved from her mother's garden. He would walk the stone path they had laid together, his hand trailing over the rough-hewn surfaces, and he could almost feel her beside him, her presence as real and comforting as the solid earth beneath his feet. His days unfolded with the gentle rhythm of a well-loved book. After his morning in the garden, he would retreat to his study, a room filled with the comforting scent of old paper and leather. As a retired librarian, David had not simply collected books, he had curated a life of stories. He found solace in the quiet order of the Dewey Decimal System, in the way a narrative could transport you, could make sense of the chaos of human emotion. His own life felt like that, a story whose most exciting chapters were over, now settling into a peaceful and reflective epilogue. The house itself was a library of their shared history. A faint chip on a coffee cup, a worn spot on the arm of a reading chair, a sun-faded photograph on the mantelpiece, each was a footnote referencing a chapter of joy. He lived a life that many would call small, or perhaps even lonely. But for David, it was rich and full. It was enough. The silence of his home was not an emptiness, but a space filled with the echoes of laughter and quiet conversation, a space that held the shape of his contentment. He did not need the noise of the outside world, because his own world was so complete. This carefully balanced ecosystem was shattered the day the moving trucks arrived next door. They came like an invading army, great metal beasts groaning and hissing as they blocked the entire street, their diesel fumes choking the scent of David's climbing roses. The quiet cul-de-sac, usually a placid stream of existence, was suddenly a churning rapid of shouted instructions, slamming doors, and the percussive thud of heavy boxes hitting wooden floors. From his window, David watched the family spill out onto the lawn. The father, Mark, was a bull of a man, barrel-chested and loud, directing the movers with an air of impatient authority. His wife, Jessica, seemed to float in his orbit, a ghost of a smile on her face, as she tried to corral their 2 young children, who were already treating the neighborhood lawns as their personal racetrack. For 2 days, the cacophony was relentless. The peace was gone, replaced by the soundtrack of a life being unpacked with brute force. Still, David was a product of a generation that believed in neighborliness. On the 3rd day, once the trucks had gone, he clipped one of his finest hybrid tea roses, a vibrant apricot-tangent-colored bloom named Eleanor's Blush, placed it in a simple bud vase, and walked over. Mark answered the door, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. He filled the doorway, his physical presence seeming to suck the air from the porch. "Yeah? Can I help you?" he asked, his tone not unfriendly, but transactional, as if David were a delivery driver. David offered the rose. "I'm David, from next door," he said with a small, genuine smile. "I just wanted to welcome you and your family to the neighborhood." Mark took the vase, his large, thick fingers looking clumsy around the delicate glass. He glanced at the flower, then past David, his eyes scanning David's modest, well-kept home, the tidy garden, the slightly faded paint on the trim. David could feel himself being assessed, categorized, and dismissed in a matter of seconds. "Mark," the man said, offering a hand. His grip was crushing, a display of casual dominance. "Appreciate it. We're still in chaos mode here. Big plans for this place." He gestured vaguely toward his own yard, a featureless expanse of green. "Gonna rip all this out, putting in a 3-level deck, saltwater pool, big outdoor kitchen with a brick oven. You won't recognize it in a few months." There was a swagger in his voice, the pride of a man who bends the world to his will. He looked at David's garden again, and this time there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, something akin to pity or perhaps contempt. It was the look a predator gives a creature that has no defenses. Jessica appeared behind him, offering David a warmer, if somewhat tired, smile. "Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you so much." She took the vase from her husband, her touch gentle, appreciative. But Mark's attention had already moved on. "Right," he said, turning back to David, effectively ending the conversation. "Well, thanks for stopping by. Gotta get back to it." The door closed, not slammed, but with a finality that left no room for further pleasantries. David walked back across his lawn, the grass cool and soft under his feet. The air in his own yard seemed sweeter, the light softer. But something had changed. The invisible barrier that had protected his sanctuary now felt porous, vulnerable. He could hear the muffled thuds and shouts from the house next door, and they were no longer just the sounds of a family moving in. They were the first tremors of an earthquake, a seismic shift that threatened the very foundations of his quiet world. The meeting had been brief, utterly forgettable to a man like Mark, but to David, it was a profound and unsettling introduction. He had looked into his new neighbor's eyes and seen a chilling emptiness, a void where empathy and respect should have been. The calm of his life was now a deceptive calm, a beautiful, sunlit sky that held the dark, unspoken promise of a devastating storm. The first crack in the neighborhood's fragile peace was not a crack at all, but a low, persistent tremor. It began on a Friday night, a month after Mark's family had moved in. David was in his study, rereading a beloved classic, when the house began to vibrate. It was a deep, rhythmic thumping, the kind of bass that bypasses the ears and settles deep in your bones. It was followed by a wave of shouting and synthetic, high-pitched music. The first of Mark's parties had begun. David, a man who valued reason and tolerance, initially dismissed it. They were new, he told himself. They were celebrating. He put in earplugs and tried to read, but the beat was a physical presence, a relentless knocking from the inside of his own skull. The party raged until 3 a.m. The next day, David found 2 empty beer bottles and a crushed pizza box on his lawn. He cleaned it up without a word. One party, he reasoned, was an anomaly. But when it happened again the next weekend, and the weekend after that, he realized it was not an anomaly. It was a pattern. The quiet cul-de-sac was now the weekend playground for Mark and his loud, boisterous friends. Their expensive cars would line the street, often parked haphazardly, their headlights cutting across David's windows at all hours. The sound of their laughter, a harsh, braying noise, carried on the night air, a violation of the gentle symphony of crickets and rustling leaves that had been David's lullaby for 30 years. After the 4th consecutive weekend of shattered sleep, David knew he had to speak up. He abhorred confrontation. His entire life had been an exercise in avoiding it, but the sanctity of his home was being compromised. He rehearsed a calm, reasonable speech in his head and, on a Sunday morning, walked over to Mark's house. The front yard was a disaster zone of party detritus. Mark answered the door shirtless, a pair of sunglasses hiding his eyes, a mug of coffee in his hand. He looked not apologetic, but irritated by the interruption. "Morning?" Mark grunted. David took a steadying breath. "Mark, good morning. I was hoping I could have a quick word with you." Mark leaned against the door jamb, his posture radiating impatience. "Shoot." "It's about the parties," David began gently. "I understand you want to enjoy your new home, but the music has been exceptionally loud, and it's been going very late into the night. It's making it quite difficult to sleep." He waited for an apology, or at least an acknowledgement. Instead, Mark slowly took off his sunglasses, revealing bloodshot, arrogant eyes. A slow smirk spread across his face. "Is that right?" he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Look, pal, I work my tail off all week. I make a lot of money. When the weekend comes, I like to blow off some steam with my friends. It's my house, my property. I'm not going to start living like a monk because my neighbor goes to bed at 9 o'clock. He took a sip of his coffee. "You should try to loosen up a bit, Dave. Might do you some good." The casual, dismissive use of Dave was a small but calculated insult. David felt a flush of anger, but he kept his voice even. "I'm only asking for a little consideration." Mark laughed, a short, humorless bark. "Yeah, okay. I'll consider it," he said, the words sounding like a mockery. He then clapped David on the shoulder, a gesture that was meant to seem friendly, but felt more like a shove. "Don't worry about it." He turned and closed the door, leaving David standing on the porch, feeling foolish and utterly dismissed. The message was clear. David's peace was an inconvenience, and Mark had no intention of being inconvenienced. The second wave of the assault came on 4 legs. Mark had a dog, a massive bull mastiff named Tank, that was less a pet and more a furry battering ram. The animal was as poorly trained and arrogant as its owner, possessing a boundless, chaotic energy that Mark made no effort to contain. The city had a leash law, but Mark seemed to believe it was a quaint suggestion meant for other people. Tank was frequently let out into Mark's unfenced front yard, where he would bound about with joyful, destructive abandon. At first, the incursions were minor. A few trampled begonias, a muddy paw print on David's pristine walkway. Each time, David would politely mention it to Mark, who would just chuckle and say, "Boys will be boys, eh, Dave? He's just a big puppy." The situation escalated on a Tuesday morning. David went out to tend to his dahlia bed, the one that held the tubers Eleanor had cultivated for over a decade. He stopped dead, his heart sinking into his stomach. The bed was a scene of utter devastation. A huge section had been dug up, the precious, irreplaceable tubers scattered across the lawn like discarded potatoes. The soil was scarred with deep claw marks and the unmistakable prints of a very large dog. The attack felt deeply personal. Those dahlias were not just flowers. They were a living connection to his wife. He had nurtured them, protected them, and now they were destroyed by his neighbor's casual negligence. This time, when David marched to Mark's door, the gentle, pleading tone was gone, replaced by a cold, hard anger. He didn't wait for Mark to speak. "Your dog destroyed my dahlia garden." Mark's smirk faltered for a moment, faced with David's uncharacteristic fury, but it was quickly replaced by a defensive sneer. "Whoa, hold on a second. How do you know it was my dog? Could have been a raccoon, a deer. There are paw prints the size of my hand all over the soil, Mark, and I saw him running through my yard yesterday evening." The evidence was undeniable, and Mark knew it. He shifted tactics from denial to belittlement. All right, calm down. It's just some flowers. It's not the end of the world. Send me a bill or something if it'll make you feel better." "You don't understand," David said, his voice low and tight. "Those were my wife's." Mark rolled his eyes. "Oh, for God's sake. Look, I'm sorry about your wife's flowers. Happy? Now if you'll excuse me, I have actual work to do." He closed the door again, this time with a definitive click. The battle lines had been drawn. The passive-aggressive comments started soon after. If Mark saw David working in the garden, he'd call over the invisible property line. "Hey, Dave, don't throw your back out playing in the mud." Or, "You know they make plastic flowers now. Lot less work." The words were always delivered with a laugh, framed as a joke, but they were tiny poison darts, each one designed to diminish David, to mock the things he held dear. David realized then that Mark wasn't just inconsiderate. He was a bully. He derived a sense of power from David's discomfort, a smug satisfaction from chipping away at his quiet, orderly world. The first cracks had shattered the illusion of neighborly peace, and through them, David could see the darkness in the man next door. His patience was exhausted. His desire for a peaceful resolution was dead. Something new was taking its place, something cold and patient, something that understood that this was no longer a dispute to be talked through, but a war to be won. The polite requests had failed. The appeals to common decency had been met with scorn. David now understood that he was not dealing with a man who was merely thoughtless, but with one who was fundamentally hostile. A shift occurred within him, a quiet, internal recalibration. The part of him that sought harmony and understanding went dormant, and the librarian, the meticulous archivist, the patient cataloger of facts took over. He would no longer engage. He would observe, and he would document. The war entered a new and uglier phase, one defined not by loud arguments, but by a campaign of silent, deliberate aggression. It started with the trash. No longer was it the accidental spillover from a party, but a calculated deposit of filth. David would come out in the morning to find a greasy fast food bag tossed into his immaculate rose bushes, or a half-empty carton of sour milk leaking onto the flagstones. The first time, he felt a surge of white-hot anger. His instinct was to march over and confront Mark, to demand an end to this childish, disgusting behavior. But he stopped himself. What would be the point? It would only lead to another dismissive smirk, another round of denials and belittlement. Instead, he went back inside, retrieved his digital camera, and began a new, somber ritual. He would photograph the offending item from multiple angles, ensuring his house and Mark's were both visible in the background to establish location. He made sure the digital timestamp was enabled. Then, and only then, would he put on his gardening gloves, clean up the mess with a grim sense of purpose, and file the images away in a new folder on his computer labeled, simply, Evidence. The trash became a regular delivery, a twisted form of communication, a soiled diaper near the bird bath, a pile of coffee grounds dumped in the center of his lawn. Each piece was a message, a territorial marking from a man determined to soil everything David held dear. And for each message, David had a methodical, silent reply. Click, file, delete. He was building an archive of ugliness, a precise and irrefutable record of his neighbor's contempt. The harassment then moved from his yard to his driveway. Mark's truck was a monstrous thing, a gleaming black pickup so large it seemed to defy the modest scale of the suburban street. It was a rolling monument to its owner's ego. and Mark began to use it as a weapon. At first, he would park it just close enough to the edge of David's driveway to make exiting a frustratingly complex maneuver, a 10-point turn where a simple reverse would once have sufficed. David said nothing. He simply took a photo before he left and after he returned. Then, the parking became openly hostile. David would come out in the morning, ready to leave for a volunteer shift at the public library or a doctor's appointment, only to find the truck parked directly behind his car, completely and utterly blocking him in. He was a prisoner on his own property. From his living room window, he could sometimes see Mark watching, a shadow in the window, enjoying the spectacle of David's entrapment. The first time it happened, David's hands shook with fury. But again, the librarian overruled the angry homeowner. He calmly took out his phone, took several clear photographs of the truck, his own trapped vehicle, and the wide-open, empty curb just a few feet away. Then he called a taxi. He would not give Mark the satisfaction of a confrontation. He would not pound on his door or lay on his horn. He would simply document the intent, the malice, the clear and deliberate act of aggression. He was treating his neighbor's behavior not as a personal dispute, but as a crime scene to be processed. This silent, one-man campaign of evidence gathering had an unfortunate side effect. It isolated him. Mark was a master of the public facade. To the rest of the cul-de-sac, he was the friendly, charismatic guy who always had a booming wave, who handed out expensive craft beers at the annual block party, whose kids were always impeccably dressed. David, on the other hand, had grown more withdrawn. He was now the strange old man next door. Neighbors would see him in his yard, not tending his flowers, but taking pictures of a stray coffee cup. They saw him getting into a taxi while his own car sat in the driveway, blocked by a truck they assumed was just parked a little carelessly. Gentle, well-meaning inquiries were made. Carol, from across the street, stopped him one afternoon as he was retrieving his mail. "David, is everything all right? You seem a bit on edge lately." He tried to explain, but the words sounded weak, petty. "He throws his trash in my yard. He blocks my car." Carol gave him a sympathetic, pitying look. "Oh, David, Mark is, well, he's a lot. A bull in a china shop. I'm sure he doesn't mean anything by it. He's just a little careless." The narrative had been set, and David was not the victim. He was the grumpy, oversensitive old man who couldn't handle his new neighbor's vibrant energy. He realized then that there would be no help from his community. They saw Mark's charm, not his cruelty. They saw David's quiet pain and misinterpreted it as bitter eccentricity. The realization was sobering, but it did not deter him. It sharpened his focus. If no one would believe his words, he would have to give them proof that was impossible to deny. With the confidence of a man who knows he has won the court of public opinion, Mark's taunts became bolder. The thin veneer of plausible deniability was stripped away. If he saw David with his camera, he would shout over the fence, his voice dripping with sarcastic amusement. "Getting my good side, Dave? Make sure the lighting is right. I want to look good for my big debut." If David was in his garden, Mark would stand on his deck, beer in hand, and offer a running commentary. "Careful there, old-timer. Don't want to break a hip. Is that a weed or one of your prize winners?" Hard to tell the difference from up here. He was no longer just harassing David. He was performing, reveling in his own impunity. He believed he was untouchable, and David let him believe it. He never rose to the bait. He would sometimes discreetly activate the voice recorder on his phone, capturing the tirades of casual cruelty. Click, file, save. Every insult, every piece of trash, every blocked driveway was another entry in a growing catalog of malice. He felt the constant, grinding pressure of the siege. His home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a forward operating base in a war he had never asked to fight. He was tired and he was stressed, but he was not broken. He was waiting, because he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was not the end. Mark was an addict, and his drug was power. These petty torments were no longer giving him the same thrill. He would need to escalate. He would need to do something bigger, something louder, something that could not be ignored. And David would be ready, with his camera, his audio recorder, and his unshakable, patient resolve. The final escalation did not come with a shout, but in the dead of the night, under the cloak of an oppressive, humid darkness. A summer storm had been threatening for days, the air thick and heavy with unspoken violence. David had spent the evening feeling a strange restlessness, an unease that settled deeper than his bones. He checked the locks on his doors twice, a thing he never did, and found himself staring out into the shadowed landscape of his garden, feeling as though it were a living, breathing thing holding its breath in anticipation. When he finally went to bed, sleep was a shallow, troubled thing, and he was awakened shortly after 2 a.m. by a sudden, brilliant flash of lightning, followed by a distant, guttural roll of thunder. It was the storm breaking. But another, far more personal storm was breaking just beyond his window. He didn't know it then, but his small, motion-activated security camera, a discreet black dome he'd installed under the eaves of his roof, was awake and recording. Its silent, infrared eye was capturing a violation so profound it would irrevocably alter the course of his life. The timestamp in the bottom corner of the digital recording would later read 2:17 a.m. A figure detaches itself from the deep shadows near the property line. The night vision footage bleaches the world of color, rendering the scene in a ghostly palette of black, white, and gray. The figure is Mark. He wears no mask, no disguise. His movements are not those of a drunken vandal or a frantic hooligan. They are slow, deliberate, imbued with a chilling sense of purpose. He moves with the predatory grace of an apex predator stalking its territory. In his gloved hand, he carries a pair of garden shears. He goes to the rose bushes first, the ones named for Eleanor. The camera records in silence, but the violence is deafening. He does not simply trample them. He kneels, and with methodical precision, snips each and every prize-winning bloom from its stem, letting them fall to the ground. Then he begins cutting the bushes themselves down to jagged, splintered stumps. He works his way through the entire bed, a gardener of destruction, leaving nothing but ruin in his wake. From there, he moves to the small stone cherub, the one David always imagined held Eleanor's smile. He lifts the heavy statue, raises it above his head, and brings it down with sickening force onto the stone path. It shatters into a dozen pieces, the sound lost to the recording, but the act of desecration is absolute. He kicks the pieces apart, his face, illuminated by another flash of lightning, set in a mask of grim satisfaction. He moves through the rest of the garden like a plague, uprooting the newly planted vegetables, stomping on the delicate ferns, kicking over the birdbath until its ceramic basin cracks. This is not destruction, it is an exorcism of hatred. The final act is the most intimate violation. Mark disappears into the shadows for a moment and returns with a can. He walks directly to David's house, to the clean, white siding just outside the kitchen window. He opens the can and with a horrifying deliberateness begins to sling its dark, viscous contents across the wall. In the monochrome of the camera, it looks like black tar, but David would soon learn it was a screaming, vibrant red. Mark paints a savage, ugly scar across the heart of the home, a final, undeniable mark of his contempt. Before he leaves, he does one last thing. He turns and looks almost directly into the lens of the camera. It is impossible to know if he sees it, a tiny black eye in the darkness. But for a long, chilling moment, his face fills the frame. There is no anger in his expression. There is no rage. There is only a look of triumphant, absolute contempt. And then, with a flicker of a smile, he melts back into the darkness from which he came, leaving behind a scene of silent, monochromatic devastation. The next morning, the world felt muffled and wrong. The storm had passed, leaving behind a clean, rain-washed world, but the sense of dread in David's chest remained. He made his tea, his hands moving on autopilot, and walked to the kitchen window to look out at his garden as he always did. The mug slipped from his fingers, shattering on the tile floor. For a long moment, he could not breathe. He could only stare. The scene was one of such personal violence that it felt like an attack on his own body. The red paint looked like a gaping wound on the side of his house. The decapitated roses, the smashed statue, the ruined beds, it was a landscape of grief. He stumbled outside, his bare feet wet with morning dew, and walked through the wreckage. He touched the splintered stem of a rose bush, his fingers tracing the sharp, clean cut. This was the work of a cold and steady hand. A profound, soul-deep sorrow washed over him, a grief so sharp it felt like the day he had lost Eleanor all over again. Her memory had been desecrated. Their sanctuary had been defiled. He forced himself back inside, his body trembling, and sat down at his kitchen table, the shards of the broken mug still at his feet. With shaking hands, he picked up his tablet and opened the security app. He found the notification. Motion detected at 2:17 a.m. He pressed play, and he watched. He watched his neighbor, the man he had tried to be reasonable with, the man the neighborhood saw as a charming leader, systematically and joyfully destroy the last beautiful thing in his life. He watched the roses fall. He watched the statue break. He watched the paint fly. He watched as Mark stared into the camera, into his soul, with that look of utter, soul-crushing disdain. As the video played, the trembling in David's hands began to subside. The hot, painful grief in his chest began to cool, then to harden, congealing into something solid and heavy, like granite. The shock receded, and in its place, a terrifying clarity emerged. He was no longer a victim. A victim weeps. A victim despairs. David felt no despair. He felt nothing at all. There was only a cold, clean, and absolute purpose coalescing in his mind. He watched the video clip a second time, then a third. He was no longer watching a recording of a crime. He was studying a piece of evidence. He was analyzing his enemy's methods. The man who had gone to sleep the night before, the quiet, gentle librarian who sought only peace, was gone forever, shattered along with the stone cherub. In his place sat someone else entirely, someone patient, someone methodical, someone who now understood that justice was not something you ask for, it was something you take. By the time the sun was high in the sky, the brokenness in David's garden was a stark and ugly reality. The neighbors who walked their dogs or retrieved their morning papers stopped and stared, their faces a mixture of shock and pity. They offered condolences, speculating about teenagers or random vandals. David accepted their sympathy with a quiet, non-committal nod. He let them believe their theories. He knew the truth, and the truth was not a weapon to be brandished in a fit of rage on the street. It was a missile to be aimed, guided, and deployed with absolute precision. His first and only call was not to the police. He knew what that would entail. A report, a misdemeanor charge for vandalism, a small fine for Mark, and a simmering, uncontained rage that would inevitably spill over in a new and more dangerous way. A slap on the wrist would not suffice. What David wanted was not punishment, but deconstruction. He wanted to take the edifice of Mark's perfect life and pull it apart, brick by brick, until whatever rotten thing lived at its core was exposed to the light. And for that, he needed a different kind of weapon. He needed the law. He found her in a small, modern office in a downtown high-rise, a stark contrast to his own world of aged wood and worn paper. Her name was Sarah Chen. She was young, perhaps 35 at the most, with a sharp, intelligent face and an air of efficiency that was almost intimidating. Her office was minimalist and immaculate. Her suit was perfectly tailored, and her handshake was firm. When David sat down, an unassuming widower in a slightly frayed tweed jacket, he could see her making a quick, professional assessment. A routine civil case, an elderly client, likely overwhelmed by the system. She listened with a practiced, patient empathy as David began to speak, her pen making neat, precise notes on a legal pad. She was the very picture of competence. But David sensed she had already filed his case away in a mental category labeled standard property dispute. That changed when he placed his tablet on her desk. "I believe the events of last night will provide some necessary context," he said, his voice as calm and steady as if he were discussing the weather. He pressed play. He watched Sarah's face as she watched the video. The mask of professional sympathy dissolved first, replaced by a focused attention. Her posture changed. She leaned forward, her elbows on the desk, her eyes narrowed. As the silent, ghostly figure of Mark began his methodical destruction, her jaw tightened. David could see a flicker of genuine shock, which was then replaced by a cold, professional anger. She saw the sneer on Mark's face as he looked toward the camera, and her expression hardened into a mask of pure, predatory focus. When the video ended, she didn't speak for a full minute. She simply stared at the blank screen, processing the calculated malice she had just witnessed. Finally, she looked up at David, and he saw that she was no longer looking at him as a simple old man, but as the possessor of an unassailable legal position. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice stripped of its earlier gentleness, now sharp and clear as glass. "That is one of the most disgusting things I have ever seen, and from a legal standpoint, it's a gift. This isn't a case, it's a slam dunk. We will file a civil suit for the full cost of the damages, which we will assess generously. We'll add punitive damages for the blatant malice and emotional distress. We will get an immediate restraining order. He will have no defense. With that video, we will financially cripple him." She spoke with the brisk, confident efficiency of a surgeon outlining a simple procedure. It was a sound, logical, and completely standard legal strategy. And it wasn't nearly enough. "No," David said quietly. Sarah paused, her pen hovering over her notes. "I'm sorry. That is a start, Miss Chen," David continued, his voice still low, but now with an undertone of steel that made her sit up a little straighter. "But it is not the goal. Making him pay for my garden is like finding a murderer for the price of the bullet. It addresses the symptom, not the disease." Sarah looked at him, a flicker of confusion in her eyes. "The disease is the man himself. I have been a librarian my entire adult life. My work is to find the story beneath the story, to see the patterns that others miss. And the pattern of this man's behavior is not normal." David then opened his briefcase and produced a series of neat folders labeled by month. He showed her the photographs of the garbage. He showed her the log of his blocked driveway, complete with dates, times, and pictures. He played for her a short audio clip he had recorded on his phone of Mark shouting insults over the fence. "This is a man who has engaged in a systematic campaign of psychological warfare against me for months. And for what? Because my quiet life offends him? Because my flowers annoy him? No, that doesn't make sense." He leaned forward, his eyes locking with hers. "Men like Mark, men who are obsessed with the facade of success and power, who react with such disproportionate rage to a perceived slight, they are not strong. They are terrified. Their whole life is a house of cards, and they see a threat in every gust of wind. The man in that video was not just destroying a garden. He was trying to annihilate something that he perceived as a threat to his own sense of self. My question, Miss Chen, is not, how much can we sue him for? My question is, what is he so desperately afraid of?" Sarah was silent again, but this time it was the silence of deep thought. She looked from the folders to the tablet, to the calm, determined man sitting before her. He had come to her with a simple case of vandalism, but he was proposing something far more complex, far more ambitious. He was proposing to use her legal knowledge as a scalpel to conduct an autopsy on a living man's life. He wasn't seeking mere compensation, he was seeking the truth. He wanted to weaponize the discovery process, to use subpoenas and depositions not just to prove the damages to his garden, but to excavate Mark's entire existence, his finances, his business dealings, his past. A slow, thin smile touched Sarah Chen's lips. Her initial assessment had been entirely wrong. This was not a standard property dispute. This was not a case that would be settled quickly out of court. This was a hunt. David Henderson had not come to her looking for a lawyer. He had come looking for a partner. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice now alive with a newfound energy, a predatory gleam in her eyes. "I have been practicing law for 10 years, and most of it is painfully boring. What you are proposing is not boring at all. You want to know what he's hiding. You believe the answer to his present is in his past." David simply nodded. "Then that is what we will find," she declared, closing the file with a crisp, definitive snap. "Let's draft the complaint. We won't just sue him for what he did to your garden. We will sue him for being who he island. The battlefield had been chosen. The strategy was set. The war for the truth was about to begin. The filing of the lawsuit was the formal declaration of war. A process server, a large, impassive man, had delivered the papers to Mark personally as he was retrieving a set of golf clubs from the trunk of his oversized SUV. The neighborhood had watched, curtains twitching. Mark's reaction, as later recounted by a talkative neighbor, was one of pure, theatrical outrage. He had laughed, torn the papers in half, and thrown them to the ground, declaring it a frivolous, pathetic lawsuit from a crazy old man. His lawyer had followed up with a letter to Sarah Chen, full of blustering threats of a countersuit for harassment and defamation. It was the predictable response of a bully who believed himself untouchable, a king swatting away a fly. But in the quiet, minimalist office of Sarah Chen, the fly was methodically planning how to dismantle the king's castle. "His arrogance is his weakness," Sarah said, tapping the threatening letter with a perfectly manicured finger. "He thinks this is about money. He thinks he can crush us with legal fees and intimidation. He doesn't realize we aren't aiming for his wallet. We're aiming for his history." David sat opposite her, a folder of his own meticulous notes on the table between them. "He is acting like a man with nothing to fear," David observed, "which, in my experience, often means he is the most terrified man in the room," Sarah nodded. "The video is our leverage. It gets us into the discovery phase. But to justify the kind of deep, invasive discovery we need, we can't just go on a fishing expedition. We need to show the court a compelling reason to believe there's more to this than a simple act of vandalism. We need to find a thread, something that suggests Mr. Reynolds isn't who he appears to be. And for that, we need someone who is very good at pulling on threads." That is how, 2 days later, David found himself in a second office that was the polar opposite of Sarah's. It was a cramped, cluttered room above a bail bondsman, smelling faintly of stale coffee and regret. The man behind the desk was Frank Miller. He was a retired police detective in his late 50s, with a rumpled suit, a face like a roadmap of tired cynicism, and eyes that seemed to have seen every possible variation of human ugliness. He didn't rise when they entered. He just gestured to 2 mismatched chairs. Sarah laid out the case with brisk efficiency, while Frank listened, his face an unreadable mask. He occasionally made a note on a dog-eared legal pad with a chewed pen. He looked at David's photos of the trash and the blocked driveway without a flicker of emotion. Then, Sarah played the video of the garden destruction. Frank watched it, his expression unchanging, but David noticed his gaze sharpen, his focus absolute. When it was over, he leaned back in his squeaking chair and steepled his fingers. "Okay," he grunted. "So your neighbor's a real piece of work. A first-class sociopath. You've got him dead to rights on video. What do you need me for? This is an open and shut case." It was David who answered, his voice calm and steady. "We believe the rage displayed in that video is abnormal. We believe it is a symptom of a much larger secret. We want you to find out who Mark Reynolds really island." Frank let out a short, dry laugh that sounded like rocks grinding together. "With all due respect, Mr. Henderson, you've been watching too much television. 99% of the time, when a rich guy acts like a world-class jerk, it's because he's a rich guy who's a world-class jerk. There's no secret. It's right there on the surface. But," he sighed, "you're paying the bills. I'll dig. Don't expect any miracles." For the next 2 weeks, Frank dug. He was a master of the mundane, tedious work of excavation that formed the bedrock of any real investigation. He started with the digital skeleton of Mark Reynolds, running his name, date of birth, and social security number through every database he had access to. The results were disappointingly, almost suspiciously, pristine. The man had no criminal record, not even a speeding ticket. His credit score was nearly perfect. He had a mortgage on his house, a loan on his truck, and a dozen credit cards, all paid on time. Frank pulled property deeds, tax records, and business filings going back 20 years. It painted a clear picture of a man on a steady, relentless climb up the ladder of success. Next, Frank turned his attention to Mark's business, Reynolds Construction. He spent days sifting through incorporation documents, state contracts, and vendor licenses. The company was legitimate, profitable, and well-regarded in the industry. The story it told was the American dream. A young, ambitious man starts with a pickup truck and a toolbox, and through grit and hard work, builds a regional empire. It was a story so perfect it could have been written by a public relations firm. The last avenue was the human one. Frank discreetly canvassed the wider community, talking to former employees, business associates, and people who knew Mark from the country club he belonged to. The narrative was unshakable. Mark was described as tough but fair, a demanding boss, a loyal friend, a generous donor to local charities. The wall of his reputation seemed flawless, impenetrable. Frank called a meeting in Sarah's office. He dropped a thick, discouragingly thin file on her desk. "I've got nothing," he announced, his voice flat with professional frustration. "Absolutely, positively, zero. As far as any official record is concerned, Mark Reynolds sprang into existence on his 18th birthday in a suburb of Chicago, got a business degree, and started building his perfect life. Before that, it's a blank. No high school records I can easily access, no childhood friends on his social media, which, by the way, is a masterpiece of curated perfection. It's all pictures of him at charity golf tournaments and family trips to Hawaii. The guy is either the cleanest man in America, or he's a ghost." Sarah's face fell with disappointment. The bold strategy felt like it was crumbling before it had even begun. "So, there's nothing? No secret family? No hidden debt? No shady business partners?" Frank shook his head. "If there is, he's buried it so deep I can't find it. My professional opinion? Your theory is wrong. He's just a bully with a bad temper who finally snapped. You should take the easy win, ruin him financially for the garden, and be done with it." There was a heavy silence in the room. The aggressive, innovative legal assault seemed to be fizzling into a standard, boring lawsuit. But David was not discouraged. He was listening intently, and he had heard the clue, the single discordant note in the symphony of Mark's perfect life. He leaned forward, his quiet voice cutting through the atmosphere of defeat. "Frank," he said, "could you repeat what you said before, about his 18th birthday?" Frank shrugged. "I said it's like he just appeared, like he didn't exist before then." David looked at Sarah, and then back at the tired investigator. A small, knowing smile touched his lips. "No one just appears, Frank. Every story has a beginning. His seems to start too abruptly. It's too neat. You haven't hit a brick wall." David's eyes gleamed with a librarian's quiet passion for uncovering a hidden truth. "You've found the edge of the page. You've found the curtain. Now we just have to figure out how to look behind it." The energy in the room shifted. Frank stared at David, his cynical mask cracking for a moment, replaced by a grudging respect. The investigation had not failed. It had just discovered its true and vital question. If the man in that house wasn't Mark Reynolds before he was 18, then who was he? David's insight had transformed the investigation. It was no longer a frustrating search for a needle in a haystack. It was a focused intellectual exercise in deconstruction. Frank Miller, the cynical ex-cop, found himself invigorated by the challenge. He had spent his career dealing with the messy, obvious truths of criminals who left their fingerprints everywhere. The case of Mark Reynolds was different. It was a puzzle, an elegant and infuriating construction of a life that was too perfect to be real. Frank's new operating theory, guided by David's quiet assertion, was that Mark Reynolds was not a person, but a carefully crafted identity, a legal fiction created to obscure a former self. The question was how to prove it. He abandoned the broad sweeps of Mark's successful adult life and began to microscopically examine the very documents that defined his existence. He started with the two pillars of any modern identity, the birth certificate and the Social Security number. The Social Security number was issued in Illinois the year Mark turned 18. On its own, this wasn't a smoking gun. It was unusual, as most people are assigned a number at birth, but there were plausible explanations. What it did was reinforce the timeline. Mark's official, documented life began at the precise moment he became a legal adult. It was the birth certificate that became Frank's obsession. He had a certified copy, issued by Cook County, Illinois, and it appeared flawless. But Frank knew that the most convincing lies are often wrapped in layers of truth. He used a contact in the Illinois Secretary of State's office, an old friend from his police academy days, to do something unusual. He didn't ask for a verification of the certificate's authenticity. He asked for the history of its issuance. A week later, he got a call. The copy on file was legitimate, but it was a copy of a delayed certificate of birth. The original had been filed not at the time of Mark Reynolds' birth 30-odd years ago, but on his 18th birthday, based on sworn affidavits from two individuals who claimed to have been present. It was a legal, if uncommon, process, a loophole big enough to drive a new identity through. Frank felt a jolt, the familiar, electric thrill of a cold case warming up. Someone had needed to legally create Mark Reynolds, because for some reason, the person he was before needed to disappear. This was the thread, the single, tiny thread that Frank could now pull. He knew the county and the year. He shifted his focus from database searches to the dusty, unglamorous archives of the Cook County Courthouse. He was no longer looking for crimes, but for the mundane legal machinery of reinvention. He spent days poring over microfiche records of legal filings from that specific year, his eyes burning from the strain. He was searching for anything that connected to the creation of his target. He sifted through thousands of petitions, probate filings, and minor civil actions. And then he found it. It was a simple, one-page document, a petition for change of name. The petitioner was a young man who had just celebrated his 18th birthday. His legal guardian had co-signed. The name he was legally and permanently shedding was Michael Anthony Costas. The name he was adopting, the name he was being reborn as, was Mark David Reynolds. Frank leaned back from the microfiche reader, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. He had it. The ghost had a name. The curtain had been found. All he had to do now was rip it down. The name was the key. Michael Anthony Costas. Frank returned to his cluttered office, the hunt now renewed with a ferocious intensity. He ran the new name through every database he had. The digital footprint for Michael Costas was faint, almost non-existent. He existed in school enrollment records in a tough, working-class suburb west of Chicago up until the age of 16. Then, he vanished. There were no further public records, no driver's license, no credit history. He had simply ceased to be. To a civilian, it would be a dead end. But Frank was an ex-cop. He knew exactly what this kind of informational void meant. It meant the records were sealed. Juvenile criminal records are a separate, protected world. When a minor turns 18, those records are often locked away from public view, a legal fiction designed to give a young offender a clean slate. But a sealed record is not an erased record. Frank now had what he needed to pry open the lock: the birth name, the date of birth, and the location. He called Sarah Chen immediately. "I have a name," he said, his voice devoid of its usual tired drawl, now sharp with purpose. "Michael Costas. I'm almost certain he has a sealed juvenile jacket. We need a court order to access it." Sarah, recognizing the breakthrough, moved with lightning speed. She drafted a motion to the court, arguing that their civil case against Mark Reynolds, which involved extreme, pathological violence, made his prior history of violent behavior, even as a juvenile, directly relevant. She argued that the man who smashed a garden with such calculated rage might have a history of it. It was a brilliant legal maneuver, using Mark's present actions to unearth his past. She called in favors, pushed the motion through the system, and 2 weeks later, a judge agreed. The Court of Illinois issued a subpoena to unseal the juvenile records of Michael Costas for review in a civil proceeding. The package that arrived at Frank's office was not an email or a fax. It was a thick, 9x12 manila envelope delivered by a court courier with the official seal of the Circuit Court of Cook County stamped in imposing red ink. It felt heavy, freighted with the weight of a buried history. Frank dismissed his secretary for the day, poured himself a cup of bitter, lukewarm coffee, and sat down at his desk. He slit the envelope open with a letter opener, his movements deliberate. Inside was a file, maybe 20 pages thick, filled with the cold, bureaucratic language of the justice system. It was the case file of The People versus Michael Costas, age 16. Frank began to read. His cynical, world-weary expression, the one he had cultivated over 30 years of seeing the worst of humanity, slowly began to crumble. This was not a story of teenage shoplifting or joyriding. The charge was attempted murder. The narrative supplement, written by the arresting officer, detailed a level of brutality that made Frank's stomach clench. Michael Costas had gotten into an argument with another boy over a trivial matter. He hadn't just punched him. He had beaten him, methodically, relentlessly, with his bare hands and feet, continuing to stomp on the boy's head and chest long after he had lost consciousness. The victim had survived, but barely. He was left with permanent brain damage, a partially paralyzed left side, and a lifetime of medical complications. Michael Costas had served 2 years in a juvenile detention facility before being released on his 18th birthday, at which point his record was sealed and he legally, officially vanished, only to be reborn as the successful, charming, and utterly ruthless Mark Reynolds. Frank finished the last page and sat back, the file lying open on his desk. The mystery was solved. The rage in the garden was not an aberration. It was an echo. It was the same monster, a little older and a lot richer, doing what he had always done. He picked up the phone. "Sarah," he said, his voice low and grim. "Tell Mr. Henderson I found his ghost." The deposition took place in a soulless conference room on the 12th floor of a glass and steel tower downtown. The air was cool and sterile, smelling of carpet cleaner and corporate indifference. A long, polished mahogany table reflected the fluorescent lights from above, creating a harsh, unforgiving glare. At one end sat Mark, flanked by his lawyer, a silver-haired man named Davies, whose expensive suit and confident posture were designed to project an aura of effortless superiority. Mark himself looked every inch the powerful CEO, dressed in a tailored navy suit, his expression a carefully calibrated mix of boredom and righteous indignation. He was here against his will, a king being forced to entertain the grievances of a peasant. On the other side of the table sat Sarah Chen, her files arranged in neat, precise stacks, her demeanor calm and almost unnervingly serene, and beside her sat David. He wore the same simple tweed jacket he always did, and he looked entirely out of place, a gentle creature of the earth, trapped in a cage of metal and glass. Mark glanced at him and offered a barely perceptible sneer, a final, silent act of intimidation. David met his gaze, his own expression as placid and deep as a winter lake. He was not here as a victim. He was here as a witness. For the first hour, the proceedings were excruciatingly dull, just as Sarah had planned. Mark's lawyer, Davies, sat back with a look of smug tolerance as Sarah asked a series of seemingly pointless questions about Mark's business. She had him describe, in detail, the founding of his company, its growth, its revenue, its standing in the community. She let him boast about his work ethic, his integrity, his self-made status. Mark, swelling with ego, took the bait. He painted a verbal portrait of himself as a titan of industry, a pillar of the community, a man whose word was his bond. David sat in perfect stillness, his hands folded in his lap, listening to the magnificent, hollow edifice of lies being constructed, brick by rhetorical brick. Then Sarah shifted. "Let's talk about your upbringing, Mr. Reynolds. For the record, where did you grow up?" Mark didn't hesitate. "A little town outside Chicago, Oak Park. Nothing special. A tough, working-class neighborhood. Taught me the value of $1, the importance of hard work. And your parents? What were their names?" He gave them names. Simple, plausible names. He spun a tale of a hard-working father and a devout mother, of a childhood that was modest but full of love and strong moral guidance. He was creating a fiction, live, under oath. His lawyer beamed. Sarah's questions were making Mark look like a saint, a man of unimpeachable character being harassed by a senile old man. "And you attended Oak Park High School? Is that correct?" Sarah asked, her tone still light and conversational. "That's right. Class of '99, Mark said with a confident smile. He was so comfortable in his lies, so certain of his own impregnable fortress. The noose began to tighten, so subtly at first that only David, who knew the truth, could feel it. Oak Park, Sarah mused, tapping her pen. It's a lovely area. While you were growing up there, did you ever know a family by the name of Costas? The change in Mark was instantaneous and profound. It was not a grand, theatrical gesture, but a sudden, deathly stillness. The easy flow of his answers ceased. A flicker of something cold and dark passed through his eyes before being suppressed. "No," he said, his voice a little too sharp. "Never heard of them." Davies, his lawyer, stirred in his chair, sensing a change in the current. "Objection. Relevance? I'm establishing my client's familiarity with the community, counsel," Sarah replied smoothly, never taking her eyes off Mark. "Just a few more questions on this topic. Mr. Reynolds, in your late teens, were you involved in any after-school clubs? Sports, perhaps?" Mark's jaw was tight. "I worked. Didn't have time for that stuff." "I see. And where was your first job after you turned 18 and, as you said, set out to make your own way in the world?" Mark's answers became clipped, monosyllabic. The confident CEO was gone, replaced by a defensive, sullen man. Davies was now on high alert, his body tense, objecting to every question, but Sarah had laid her foundation perfectly. Every question was technically relevant to establishing Mark's character and background, the very things he had so proudly boasted of moments before. Then, Sarah stopped asking questions. She reached into one of her neat files and pulled out a single, photocopied document. She let it sit on the table for a moment before sliding it across the polished surface. It came to a stop directly in front of Mark. "Mr. Reynolds," she said, her voice now stripped of all warmth, becoming a cold, clinical instrument. "I am showing you what has been marked as Plaintiff's Exhibit D. Can you please identify this document for the record?" Mark stared at the paper, as if it were a coiled snake. The document was a petition for change of name. Davies snatched it from the table, his eyes scanning it quickly. David saw the silver-haired lawyer's face pale, the blood draining from it, leaving behind a pasty, gray shock. He knew, in that instant, that his client had lied to him. He knew he was trapped. Sarah's voice cut through the sudden, thick silence. "Mr. Reynolds, is it not true that you did not, in fact, grow up in Oak Park? Is it not true that on August 14th, 22 years ago, in the Circuit Court of Cook County, you, under your legal birth name, filed this petition?" Mark was paralyzed, his mouth half open, a silent scream trapped in his throat. Sarah did not wait for an answer. "Is it not true, Mr. Costas, that you have committed perjury under oath here today?" Davies found his voice. "Objection. This is an ambush. I'm instructing my client not to answer." But it was too late. The damage was done, and Sarah was not finished. She reached into her files again and pulled out a second, much thicker document. She slid it across the table, and it landed on top of the first one with a soft, definitive thud. "And is it not also true," she continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet dominating the room, "that the reason for this name change, the reason for this elaborate, decades-long lie, was to hide this? Exhibit E, Mr. Costas, your juvenile criminal record, unsealed by court order. The record of your conviction for the attempted murder of a 15-year-old boy named Daniel Peterson, whom you beat so severely he was left permanently disabled." Oddly, the carefully constructed world of Mark Reynolds shattered. The man at the table was gone, and in his place was a cornered, feral animal. A strangled, inhuman sound escaped his throat. He lunged across the table, his hands clawing, his face a grotesque mask of pure, murderous rage. "You bitch!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "You lying bitch!" Davies and a security guard grabbed him, restraining him as he thrashed, his expensive suit now a wrinkled mess, his face purple with fury. The court reporter's fingers flew across her machine, capturing every curse, every threat. The videographer, a true professional, kept the camera steady, zooming in on the complete and utter unraveling of the man who was once Mark Reynolds. Amidst the chaos, Sarah Chen sat back in her chair, her work done. She calmly packed her files, her expression impassive. And David, the quiet man in the tweed jacket, stood up. He did not look at the screaming, thrashing creature that had been his neighbor. He had seen the truth, and it was uglier than he had ever imagined. He adjusted his jacket, turned, and walked out of the conference room, leaving the sound of a life imploding behind him. The mask had been ripped away. The monster was exposed, and the unmasking was only the beginning. The violent implosion in the deposition room was merely the first tremor. The earthquake that leveled the life of Mark Reynolds was a quiet, bureaucratic event, executed with the cold, elegant precision of a master strategist. Mark's lawyer, Davies, scrambled to contain the damage, filing emergency motions to seal the deposition transcript and strike the juvenile record from the proceedings, arguing it was inflammatory and prejudicial. He was trying to put a lid on a volcano that had already blown. But Sarah Chen was a step ahead. Before Davies could even get a hearing, she filed a comprehensive motion for summary judgment. It was a masterstroke, a document that laid out the undisputed facts of the case so clearly and brutally that it argued a trial was unnecessary. And attached to this motion, as official exhibits now entered into the public record, was everything. Exhibit A, the high-definition video of the garden's destruction. Exhibit B, the petition for the name change from Michael Costas to Mark Reynolds. Exhibit C, the complete, unsealed juvenile record detailing the charge and conviction for attempted murder. Exhibit D, the full, unedited transcript of the deposition, immortalizing Mark's lies, his perjury, and his eventual, violent outburst. The bomb was no longer hidden. It was on public display, its fuse sizzling. It did not take long for the world to notice. The first to find it was a young, hungry blogger who covered the local courthouse beat. He had set up a digital alert for lawsuits involving prominent local business figures. When the motion appeared in the online court docket, his computer pinged. He opened the file, his eyes widening as he read through the exhibits. He wasn't just looking at a lawsuit, he was looking at the script for a Shakespearean tragedy. His post went live before noon the next day. It was a dry, factual account, simply laying out the contents of the public legal filing. But the facts were so sensational, so utterly damning, that they needed no embellishment. The story was picked up by the local newspaper's website, and from there, it exploded. By the evening news, Mark Reynolds was the lead story. His polished corporate headshot was displayed next to the grainy black and white infrared image of him slashing at a rose bush. News anchors spoke his name, followed immediately by the name he had tried to kill and bury, Michael Costas. The words attempted murder and permanently disabled victim were repeated over and over, becoming an inseparable part of his identity. On the quiet cul-de-sac, the news spread like a virus. It arrived via text messages, hushed phone calls, and shared links on neighborhood social media pages. The first reaction was universal: stunned disbelief. This couldn't be the same Mark Reynolds. The charming, boisterous man who hosted the best 4th of July barbecues, the man who always had a friendly wave for everyone? It had to be a mistake. But the evidence was absolute. Someone posted a link to the security camera footage, and they watched, horrified, as the man they thought they knew transformed into a methodical, hateful monster under the ghostly green glow of the night vision camera. The collective guilt was palpable. They remembered David, the quiet, grieving widower they had dismissed as eccentric and grumpy. They recalled his strange, obsessive picture-taking and his withdrawn demeanor, and they understood, with a sickening lurch, that they had not been witnessing paranoia, but the quiet documentation of a relentless persecution. The judgment of the community was swift, silent, and absolute. There were no meetings, no angry confrontations. There was simply a turning away. The next time Mark pulled his oversized truck into his driveway, the street fell silent. Curtains were drawn. The friendly waves he was accustomed to were gone, replaced by people abruptly turning to inspect a flower bed or hurry inside their homes. Carol, the neighbor who had once advised David to be more understanding, was bringing in her recycling bins when she saw Mark get out of his truck. Their eyes met for a second. She did not smile or nod. She simply dropped the bin, turned, walked back into her garage, and pulled the door shut. The sound of it closing echoed down the silent street. He was no longer a neighbor. He was a contamination. The fallout spread to his professional life with breathtaking speed. His company, Reynolds Construction, had been built on his carefully cultivated image of rugged integrity and self-made success. That image was now toxic. The phones in his office, which once rang with lucrative offers, now rang with clients canceling multi-million-dollar contracts, citing morality clauses in their agreements. Business partners he had known for years suddenly stopped returning his calls. His name, once his greatest asset, was now an anchor dragging his empire to the bottom of the sea. The social death was just as complete. He received a cold, formal letter from his country club informing him that his membership was under review, which was a polite way of telling him never to show his face there again. The charities he had donated to, seeking the public acclaim, quietly removed his name from their websites and gala programs. The entire scaffolding of the life he had built, the reputation, the friendships, the respect, all of it collapsed, because all of it had been built on the rotten foundation of a lie. But the final, most devastating judgment came from within his own home. His wife, Jessica, had been blindsided. She had lived with a man, raised 2 children with him, and had never known his real name or the terrible violence he was capable of. The news didn't just reveal a crime, it revealed that her entire marriage was a fraud. David witnessed the final act of the tragedy a week after the story broke. A moving van, modest and unassuming, pulled into Mark's driveway. It was not the grand chariot of arrival that had announced their presence years before, but a quiet, somber vessel of departure. David watched from his window as Jessica, her face pale and drawn, but her movements firm with resolve, directed the movers. She was not taking the grand furniture or the expensive art. She was taking the children's beds, their toys, her own clothes, and a few boxes of personal effects. She was excising herself and her children from his life. Mark came out once, his face a ruin of desperation and rage, and tried to speak to her. She didn't shout. She didn't argue. She simply held up a hand, shook her head, and turned her back on him, a gesture of finality more powerful than any scream. She was not just leaving a husband. She was fleeing a monster. As the van pulled away, David looked across at the big imposing house next door. It was no longer a symbol of success and power. It was just a house, a hollow monument to a life that had been utterly and completely erased. The end of the war was not marked by a climactic courtroom battle, but by a quiet, anticlimactic surrender. Following the catastrophic deposition, Mark Reynolds, or Michael Costas, ceased to exist as a functional human being. His lawyer, facing a client who had committed blatant perjury and was now the subject of a media firestorm, promptly filed a motion to withdraw from the case. Mark, now without legal representation and reportedly in a state of complete breakdown, never responded to any further court filings. Sarah Chen's motion for summary judgment was granted by a judge in a nearly empty courtroom. David was awarded the full, itemized cost of the damages to his home and garden, a significant sum for his emotional distress, and a punitive award so large it was clearly meant to serve as a public punishment. Sarah called David from the courthouse steps to deliver the news of their total victory. She was professionally elated, but David's response was muted. "Thank you, Sarah," he said, his voice quiet. "You did extraordinary work." He then hung up, the feeling in his chest not one of triumph, but of a profound and hollow emptiness. He had won. The bully had been vanquished. So why did it feel so much like a loss? In the weeks that followed, David became a spectator to the final, pathetic disintegration of the man next door. A bright red "for sale" sign was hammered into the lawn, soon replaced by a more aggressive, ominous sign that read "bank-owned auction." The formidable house, once a hub of loud parties and arrogant energy, now sat dark and silent, its windows like vacant eyes. Weeds began to creep up the edges of the perfectly manicured lawn. It was a monument to ruin, a testament to the corrosive power of a truth that had been buried for too long. David found no joy in watching this decay. Each time he looked at the house, he thought not of Mark's smug grin, but of Jessica's stricken face, of the 2 young children whose lives had been irrevocably broken by the sins of their father. He had set out to achieve justice, to protect his sanctuary, but in ripping the mask from the monster, he had inadvertently brought the whole stage crashing down, injuring the innocent actors who stood nearby. Justice, he was learning, was not the clean, satisfying equation he had read about in books. It was a blunt instrument, a messy, brutal force that often left as much damage in its wake as the original crime. The victory felt like ashes in his mouth. He used a portion of the settlement money to hire a landscaping crew. They came with wheelbarrows and shovels, clearing away the wreckage, digging up the hacked stumps of Eleanor's roses, and carting away the shattered pieces of the stone cherub. They laid fresh sod where the ground had been scarred and used pressure washers to blast away the ugly red stain on his house, leaving behind a faint, ghost-like outline that only he could see. When their work was done, the garden was a blank slate, a neat, orderly, and entirely soulless space. The real work, the work of restoration, he had to do himself. He spent his days on his knees in the rich, dark soil, his hands, once accustomed to the delicate feel of paper, relearning the texture of the earth. He planted new rose bushes, a hardy, vibrant yellow variety. They were not a replacement for Eleanor's. He knew nothing could be, but they were a promise of a different future. He installed a simple, elegant granite birdbath where the cherub had once stood. He did not want to erase the memory of what had been lost, but to create a new space for life to gather. The neighbors, who had once avoided his gaze, now approached him with a quiet, deferential respect. They brought him cuttings from their own gardens, offered him cups of coffee, and spoke to him in gentle tones, their conversations laced with an unspoken apology for their prior blindness. The community was healing, but a scar remained. The easy, innocent trust of the cul-de-sac was gone, replaced by a more somber, knowing camaraderie. They had all learned a hard lesson about the darkness that could lurk behind a perfect lawn and a charismatic smile. Slowly, painstakingly, the garden began to live again. New buds appeared, and the vibrant yellow of the roses offered a splash of defiant color against the memory of what had happened. David's routine returned, the quiet mornings on the porch, the peaceful afternoons in his study. But the peace he found was not the same as the peace he had lost. The old peace had been a product of blissful ignorance. This new peace was a product of hard-won survival. The security camera remained under the eaves of his roof, its little red light a constant, blinking reminder. When a new family, young and full of cheerful energy, eventually bought the house next door from the bank, David was friendly but watchful. He would never again take tranquility for granted. The story of what had happened became a piece of neighborhood lore, a cautionary tale that ensured no one on this quiet street would ever again ignore the quiet pleas of a neighbor in distress. One evening, David sat on his back porch, a cup of tea in his hand, surveying his reborn garden. The air was cool, the scent of blooming flowers was sweet, and the world was, for all intents and purposes, at peace. He had won the war. He had his home back. He had his justice. Yet, the victory brought no soaring sense of satisfaction, no thrill of righteous vindication. It brought only a quiet, weary understanding that some battles leave scars on the victor, as well as the vanquished. The quiet librarian had been forced to become a warrior, and he was not sure he would ever truly be able to lay down his arms again. The quiet of the evening settled around him, but in his mind, a single, unanswered question lingered. Why? Why such personal, venomous hatred aimed at a garden? It was a mystery he thought would remain forever unsolved. Months passed. The scorched earth of the conflict gave way to the fragile green shoots of a new normal. Autumn arrived, painting the leaves of the cul-de-sac in hues of amber and gold. The for sale sign in front of Mark's old house now had a cheerful sold banner slapped across it, and the sounds of a new family, full of laughter and youthful energy, had begun to fill the void. David's garden was thriving in the cool air. The new yellow roses had bloomed with a defiant beauty, and the granite birdbath had become a gathering place for the neighborhood's sparrows and finches. A quiet, resilient peace had returned. It was on a cool Saturday afternoon, as David was gently pruning his new roses, that he saw a familiar car pull up to the curb. It was Jessica, Mark's ex-wife. She looked different. The haunted, shell-shocked woman from the moving van was gone. She was thinner, and there were tired lines around her eyes, but she held herself with a new, quiet strength. She was a survivor. David felt no animosity, only a shared, unspoken history. He put down his shears and met her at the gate. She did not want to stay long. She stood in his kitchen, refusing his offer of tea, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I don't expect you to understand, or to forgive," she began, her voice low but steady. "But I felt I owed you an explanation. I needed to understand what he became, what he always was, I suppose. I've been talking to people, therapists, trying to piece it all together." She looked out the kitchen window, at the garden that had been the epicenter of their shared trauma. "It was never about you, Mr. Henderson. I know that now. It was about the roses." David looked at her, confused. "The yellow ones?" "No," she said, shaking her head. "The old ones, the ones he destroyed." She paused, as if the memory was a physical pain. "What kind were they?" "They were a hybrid tea," David said softly. "A rather rare variety. Eleanor called them Eleanor's blush." Jessica closed her eyes, and a single tear traced a path down her cheek. "My father," she whispered, "was a cruel man, an abusive man. To my mother, to me, and to the troubled boys who worked for him. And he was a rose fanatic. His entire garden was filled with a single variety he was famous for. A rare, prize-winning hybrid tea rose with an apricot, blushing color. The final, terrible piece of the puzzle slid into place. The unspoken truth behind the entire tragedy revealed itself in the quiet of David's kitchen. "My father was the man Michael, the man you knew as Mark, got into a fight with all those years ago. It wasn't a fight between two boys. My father had tormented him for months. That boy he nearly killed, he was just a bystander. The rage was meant for my father." The whole ugly, twisted history was suddenly clear. Every time Mark had looked over the fence, he hadn't seen David, the quiet librarian. He had seen the ghost of his tormentor. He saw the very same roses that his abuser had so lovingly tended while making his own life a living hell. David's sanctuary had been, for Mark, a living, breathing monument to his own trauma and powerlessness. The constant, methodical harassment, the destruction, the paint thrown like blood, it was not an attack on a neighbor. It was a desperate, psychotic attempt to kill a ghost, to finally destroy the man he could never touch. It was the final, agonizing scream of a boy who had been brutalized into silence decades ago. David felt a profound, sorrowful wave wash over him. The cold satisfaction of his victory, the grim pride in his meticulous quest for justice, all of it evaporated, replaced by a deep and aching tragedy. This was never a simple story of a good man versus a bad man. It was the catastrophic, inevitable conclusion of a story that had begun long before he had ever moved onto this quiet street. He had simply been the stage on which the final, bloody act was performed. He walked Jessica to her car. They were not enemies nor friends. They were simply two survivors, bound by the collateral damage of another man's pain. As she drove away, David walked back to his garden, now bathed in the soft, forgiving light of late afternoon. He looked at the vibrant yellow roses, symbols of his own survival, and he finally understood. He had sought justice, and he had found it. But the truth he had uncovered was far more complex and heartbreaking than he had ever imagined. The truth had not set anyone free. It had simply revealed the cages they had been in all along. Never underestimate the silence of a man who has endured too long. For when he finally decides to speak or to act, he does so with the weight of every silent moment behind him. David's quiet resilience had not been born of weakness, but of a profound strength. He had sought not revenge, but balance. Yet he learned that true justice is rarely about victory or defeat. It is simply the relentless, unsparing process of truth coming to light. It does not always heal, and it does not always bring peace, but it is as inevitable as the rising sunday. And sometimes, the most we can do is tend our own gardens and show compassion for the unseen, unimaginable wars that rage just over the fence, behind the closed doors of our neighbors' homes. Thank you for joining us for this story. We invite you to return as we continue to explore the quiet dramas and hidden truths that lie just beneath the surface of everyday life.